the one tactic that does seem to work for President Zelensky is attacking Russian energy infrastructure. Um, Russia seems to have tried to protect the stuff that's on to the west of the country, the stuff that's closest to Ukraine. But the longer the weapons longer range weapons that Ukraine gets, the more vulnerable the Russian energy infrastructure is, and the more Putin is scratching his head to try and work out how to protect it.
Putin is, I frequently say this, sitting behind his big oak desk in Moscow with a large glass of best Russian vodka in his best Russian crystal with a big white cat on his knee and is stroking it. Because, at the strategic level, he's calling a lot of the shots. He's got Donald Trump marching to his drumbeat. We saw that with the 28-point plan that the Russians give to Witkoff, and Witkoff then presented it as the American peace plan. We've seen it the way he's got NATO fracturing, or that certainly the EU is fracturing in certain areas, and Putin thinks he has got more control over what's going on than I reckon he actually does, because he's been misled by his tactical commanders, as we saw with Kupiansk, and he's very confident. And that confidence comes into what's going on with Trump. And we've got the peace negotiations that are going on at the moment. And you talked about the European leaders in Berlin. What do you think is going to come out of that?
Well, firstly, I'm not as positive as I think a lot of our fellow commentators are. Certainly, a lot of the news talks about we're 90% of the way there, we're nearly, and you go, well, and then in the same breath, MI6 is turning around and say there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Putin is remotely considering negotiating. And the other thing is, I think it's very difficult to play these things out in public. You can't play negotiations like this in public, because Zelensky knows that if he even gave a hint he'd be prepared to cede territory, Putin would take that as a free gift and come to the table. That's already part. That's not a negotiation. That's already. So the only thing that came out from it was alleged that Zelensky said that NATO wouldn't be on the table anymore. But you and I would probably violently agree that it was very unlikely NATO was ever going to be on the table. But the principle, the key issue, I think, here is that despite all the rhetoric, it's clearly up to Ukraine. Territory is going to be very difficult for Ukraine to take back. I think there's an inevitability. And when I was last out there, even Ukrainians now are saying there feels like an inevitability that some of their territory will have to be ceded, whether permanently or temporarily, as a compromise. But they're not going to say that yet, because the principle, the key issue is how on earth do you create the security guarantees you need to make sure that Putin doesn't pause for 5 years and then come again? You and I both know, the history of this. Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power. It agreed to give up those nuclear weapons in return for a cast iron guarantee from America, from Russia, from the UK, signed on the Budapest Memo of 1994. And within 20 years, Putin had ripped it up, moved into Crimea. 10 years later, had moved in to the Ukraine. So it will not be possible for America's Trump or anybody to sign a bit of paper and say, no, we promise to come to your aid if there's a problem. Zelensky will never accept that. And therefore, I think the issue, which a lot of Europeans are now stepping up, and my final thoughts on this, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts strategically here, is America, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So you get the sense that the president is turning around and going, Trump's saying, right, why are we involved with this? I'm going to worry about China. I'm still committed to NATO. It's on the European continent. It's a European problem. And all of a sudden, Europe's going, we don't really, and it's not the United States of Europe. It's a whole bunch of individual countries with their own language, their own culture, their own priorities. How on earth do you drag those countries together? Probably the four powerhouses of France, Germany, Poland, and the UK. They probably could get a credible capability if they could work together on it. But the prevailing view, I think, is Putin will only stop when either he's achieved objectives or he's forced to stop. And I think there are a number of ways you and I could discuss about how that he could be forced to stop. And I think somebody's going to have to step up to the plate and make that happen.
Yeah, well, we'll go on to that in a moment. But, I agree with you completely, because, I think Europe is still trying to work out what it should have been working out 10, 15, 20 years ago. how it gets together and provides this collective defense without that US guarantee and without all the capabilities that the US brought to the table. And that's something that's scaring people because it's a national requirement to get your defense budget and have your defenses the way that you want to get them configured. And we're looking at things. We get the warnings that come out of CDS, Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Rich Knighton, yesterday in London, and he virtually echoed what the new head of MI6 said about the Russian threat and everything else. And it's quite clear that the UK is making all the right political noises about increasing our defence budget, but actually that's not turning into hard cash and capability being bought for the front line to match the perceived threat and to match the delta that there would be in the gap if the Americans withdrew. We're seeing other nations stepping up and buying kit, the Poles, the Germans, but it's the Poles and the Germans and the Scandinavian countries, of course. Do you think, what do you think of head MI6 and CDS's comments? And do you think that we are actually properly focused on the threat and as a country stepping up to the plate?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? The headline, I think, is you related to Germany there. A colleague of mine was chatting to the chief of defence in Germany and talking to him about budgets. And he apparently, how much money have you got to spend? And he just apparently said, I've been told, keep spending, we'll tell you when to stop. And they are rearming because they absolutely see a war coming and they have to do something about it. I think what's fascinating, I don't know about you, but I've never seen such blunt comments from a chief of defence staff as we got from the Roosie lecture yesterday. And one could easily dismiss it as saying, OK, chief of the defence has decided to run rogue. I know Sir Rich Knighton very well. He's probably the smartest man of his generation, and he's not the man who is going to be shooting off his mouth. That was a sanctioned speech. I think the challenge at the moment, internal for the government, is we had a strategic defence review. New government comes in. I think that was pretty well received, the defence review, but that's a vision of what defence is going to look like for the next 10 years. But vision without funding is hallucination. The money profile over that was the Defence Investment Plan, the DIP, that was meant to be completed by the end of August. I've not seen anything of that yet, and it doesn't appear that it's going to come out to the new year. Meanwhile, the government has made clear its financial priorities when Rachel Reeves announced there was going to be more money for welfare and not a mention of defence. And there is this feeling, and I deal with a lot of the current serving military commanders who have to be somewhat cautious about what they say, but there's evident anger building because they're turning around and going, we think that there is an element of playing Trump long. He'll be out of power in a few years' time. Promise jam tomorrow, promise the 3.5% to 5% GDP, but in 10 years' time, that's a tripling of the defence budget. But if you push that out to 10 years' time and don't do anything now, then maybe you'll still be able to manage your priorities. And I think that's angering people now. That's why Chief of the Defence Staff said what he did, because he's making a wake-up call that the best way, as you and I both know, to avert war is to prepare for war. Because the more credible that you can have your military forces, the more you put a seed of doubt in your adversary that goes, I'm not sure the benefits outweigh the risks. And therefore, that is why we need to be investing in defence, to make sure that we are secure in the future.
So come on, let's get back to what I said at Park. How are we going to force Putin to capitulate, to sign a peace deal, to move on and focus somewhere else?
Yeah, so my own view is that you can either use it by force or economically. Economic really hasn't worked that well. By force, the one tactic that does seem to work for President Zelensky is attacking Russian energy infrastructure. Russia seems to have tried to protect the stuff that's on to the west of the country, the stuff that's closest to Ukraine. But the longer longer range weapons that Ukraine gets, the more vulnerable the Russian energy infrastructure is. And the more Putin is scratching his head to try and work out how to protect it. And whilst it's a great shame, Tomahawk missiles, I think, would have been a great addition from President Trump. He could have forced President Putin's hand. That would have made life incredibly uncomfortable. Who only knows what was said in that phone call between Putin and Trump? But whatever Putin did, he dissuaded Trump from handing over those missiles. But I think it's going to be a concerted effort, A, to provide more technology to Ukraine. So we may not be able to sell them long-range missiles, but we can certainly help them build them, and quickly, and without all of the test and evaluation rubbish that we have to do in peacetime. In wartime, they just build them, fire them, see if they work. And the other bit is actually looking at whether a no-fly zone over part or all of Ukraine would have, in my humble opinion, a dramatic impact on Putin's calculus. It's minimal risk because, frankly, I'm a former aircrew, but you're putting ones or twos of aircrew lives at risk. But it's a very powerful statement. And I, for one, believe Western air power massively dominates what Russia has. It would cause a major challenge for them.
Well, if you can get the air ISR up in the place and the coordination, you can see any threat that's coming quite easily from a long way off, and keep the individual air crews safe from that. And I agree with you from that perspective. We've got Ukraine has just launched its launched it. They have paraded their own ballistic missile capability, which Zelensky said was coming, and they said they're going to manufacture lots of those. So we've got lots of Ukraine's ballistic missiles. We've got the Flamingo long-range cruise missile. Do you think that the energy infrastructure is Putin's Achilles heel then?
I think what you said earlier on in this interview, I think is very important, that one of the things Putin can't afford to lose is the tacit support of his people. And the more people start to feel the pain, the more the oligarchs, where the real power probably lies, realize that the moment they can't go on holiday with their kids to the south of France, they can't enjoy their luxury yachts, they can't enjoy... All of a sudden now, if austerity starts to bite into Russia as well as a load of people losing their loved ones there, I think Putin is well aware that support can evaporate very quickly. One of the things that funding the war is key. Funding the war seems to be coming from energy. Therefore, the more you can target that, as you said, there are shortcut falls in petrol and diesel at stations. There's less revenue coming in. Russian reserves of finances are decreasing rapidly. It is not a short-term hit. But if we are in the principle that says, Russia needs to be forced to that table, I believe things like Tomahawk missiles and have a concerted effort to provide Ukraine with long-range weapons targeting that energy infrastructure is probably a very good way of putting a lot of pressure onto President Putin.
Well, Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, and Pete Hegseth, as you're listening to Times Radio Frontline, you've got the advice, you know what to do. But Sean Bell, it's been a real pleasure talking to you again on Times Radio Frontline.
Always a pleasure, Philip.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.